In the labyrinthine streets of Victorian London, beneath the imposing facades of grand houses and the bustling commerce of the age, lurked a darkness far more profound than the mere absence of light. It was a darkness that permeated the very fabric of society, a hidden horror cloaked in soot and silence, endured by those too small and too voiceless to resist. We often conjure images of gaslit streets, of Dickensian characters, of a burgeoning empire at its peak. But peel back that romanticized veneer, and you uncover a reality so brutal, so psychologically scarring, and so viscerally agonizing that it defies easy comprehension. This is the story of the Victorian chimney sweeps, not as quaint figures of historical fancy, but as the unwilling participants in a prolonged, systematic form of torture, a horrifying truth far more brutal than you can possibly imagine. Forget the jolly sweep, the lucky omen of folklore. The true chimney sweep of the 19th century was a child, often no older than 6 or 7, sometimes as young as 4. He was a small, expendable cog in the vast, unforgiving machine of industrial progress, chosen for his diminutive size, and forced into an existence that was a constant negotiation with pain, claustrophobia, and the ever-present threat of suffocation or agonizing death. Imagine, if you can, the raw terror. You are a child, perhaps barely weaned from your mother's breast, ripped from the meager comfort of a workhouse bed, or sold by desperate parents for a pittance. You are handed over to a master sweep, a figure often as hardened as the soot that clung to his every pore, whose training methods amounted to a calculated regimen of physical and psychological breaking. The very first climb was designed to crush the spirit and the body. The chimney, a jagged, dark, and often burning hot shaft, awaited. These were not the wide, spacious flues of grand manor houses, but the narrow, winding passages of urban dwellings, built to conserve heat and maximize space, often no wider than a man's torso, narrowing even further at bends and elbows. The child, stripped naked or clad only in rags, would be coaxed, or, more commonly, forced into this infernal opening. Picture the scene. A small, trembling body pushed into a space designed for smoke and fire, not flesh and bone. The master sweep, standing below, would shout instructions, his voice muffled by the brickwork. The child would begin the agonizing ascent, relying on elbows and knees, scrabbling for purchase on the sooty, uneven bricks. This initial climb was not just about cleaning. It was about breaking in the child, hardening their tender skin, and eradicating any natural instinct for fear or self-preservation. The skin on their knees and elbows, unaccustomed to such friction, would quickly abrade, peeling away in raw strips. Blood would mix with the grime, forming a sickening paste. For the master, this was a necessary step. "The climbing boys," wrote one contemporary observer, "are forced up by blows or by lighting straw at the bottom of the chimney." Can you conceive of such cruelty? A small fire, ignited directly beneath the child, sending stinging smoke and scorching heat up the flue, forcing them higher, deeper into the suffocating darkness, with no escape but continued ascent. The screams, muffled by brick, would be a testament to the agony, a sound often ignored by the master and unheard by the unwitting inhabitants of the house. If a child hesitated or cried out too much, the master had other methods. Sharp sticks, often armed with pins, would be jabbed into the child's feet, buttocks, or even up their legs, a constant, pricking torture designed to extract compliance. "They frequently lie crying in the chimney," one report noted, "and dare not come out for fear of being beaten." The choice was simple: endure the excruciating pain of the chimney or face the master's wrath, which was often far worse. Within days, or weeks at most, the soft, sensitive skin of their knees, elbows, and even ankles would be transformed. Scar tissue, thick and black, with ingrained soot, would build up, forming what were grimly known as chimney sweepers' pads. These calluses, however, were not a sign of resilience, but of perpetual injury, a grotesque testament to their daily ordeal. They were living tools, their bodies molded by the very architecture they were forced to cleanse. The terror of the climb was multifaceted. Beyond the searing pain of friction, burns, and forced movements, there was the claustrophobia. Imagine being trapped in a space so tight that your chest felt compressed, every breath a struggle. The air was thick with the dust of centuries of fires, fine, black soot, sharp particles of creosote, and the occasional dislodged brick or bird's nest. Inhaling this mixture constantly led to chronic respiratory problems. Many developed a hacking sweeps cough, the early sign of permanent lung damage, asthma, bronchitis, and eventually the insidious creep of tuberculosis were common occupational hazards, diseases that would slowly choke the life out of these children over years. And then there was the heat. Not just the intentional fires, but the residual heat from recent use, radiating from the bricks, trapping the children in an oven-like environment where sweat mixed with soot, stinging their eyes, and exacerbating every raw abrasion. But the physical torture was only one layer of the horror. The psychological torment was profound. These were children denied a childhood. They were treated as commodities, property, less than human. Their days began before dawn, typically around 4 or 5 a.m. They would be marched through the still sleeping streets, carrying their master's tools, their faces and clothes a uniform smudge of black, setting them apart, marking them as outcasts. Their diet was meager, their sleep broken, and their hygiene virtually non-existent. They lived in squalor, often sleeping in cellars or sheds, on sacks of soot never truly clean. Their skin was permanently discolored, their hair matted and black. The constant exposure to grime meant that many suffered from chronic skin infections, lice, and scabies. Their eyes, perpetually irritated by soot and smoke, were often red-rimmed and inflamed. The social stigma was immense. They were seen as dirty, an untouchable class, even by the working poor. No one wanted to be near a chimney sweep, a walking embodiment of filth. This isolation, this constant dehumanization, coupled with the daily threat of pain and death, fostered a deep sense of despair and resignation. These children learned to suppress their natural instincts, to ignore their pain, to become numb. What does that do to a developing mind? What does it do to the very concept of self? One of the most horrific consequences of their trade was the dreaded chimney sweeps cancer, or, as it was medically known, scrotal carcinoma. First identified by surgeon Percival Pott in 1775, this was arguably the first industrially induced cancer, a direct result of prolonged exposure to the carcinogenic hydrocarbons in soot. It began as a small, seemingly innocuous lesion or wart on the scrotum, often mistaken for an irritation or chancre. But it would steadily grow, burrowing deep into the flesh, creating a painful, suppurating ulcer that would spread to the groin, abdomen, and eventually, if left untreated, consume the entire lower body. Imagine the agonizing progression of such a disease. A child, usually a boy or young man, now perhaps in his late teens or early 20s, suffering from a festering, constantly bleeding wound in his most intimate area. The stench alone, even for those around him, would be unbearable. The pain would be constant, a gnawing, burning agony that no contemporary medicine could truly alleviate. Without intervention, which was rare and often too late, the disease would lead to a slow, horrific death, the body consumed by a decaying mass, a grotesque monument to a life spent in forced degradation. This wasn't a quick death from suffocation. This was a protracted, agonizing, and public deterioration, a cruel legacy of their childhood profession. The mortality rates for climbing boys were shockingly high. They died from falls, from being trapped, from burns, and from a myriad of diseases. One of the most common causes of death was suffocation, often due to a fall of soot. As a child climbed, a large accumulation of soot, loosened by their movements, could suddenly collapse, burying them alive. Consider the case of George Brewster, an 8-year-old sweep. In 1817, he became trapped in a chimney in the East Riding of Yorkshire. His master, fearful of damaging the chimney, refused to allow it to be pulled down. George's agonized cries could be heard for hours, slowly fading. By the time he was finally extricated, it was too late. He was suffocated, his small body lifeless and covered in black dust. The tragedy of George Brewster, and countless others like him, was that their deaths were entirely preventable, the result of a callous disregard for human life in the pursuit of cleanliness and profit. Such deaths were not isolated incidents. They were a grim, regular occurrence, so common that coroners often recorded them with a chilling detachment, simply listing suffocation in a chimney as the cause. For the masters, a dead child was merely an unfortunate inconvenience, easily replaced by another from the seemingly endless supply of poverty-stricken orphans or desperate families. How, you might ask? Could such an overt form of child torture persist for so long in a society that prided itself on its moral compass and its burgeoning humanitarian movements? The answer is complex, rooted in economic necessity, social indifference, and powerful vested interests. Firstly, there was the sheer demand. The Industrial Revolution had led to a boom in construction, with houses packed tightly together, each with multiple chimneys. Every fireplace, every stove, needed a clean flue to function efficiently and safely. A dirty chimney was a fire hazard, a source of smoke, and a sign of poor housekeeping. Mechanical brushes, while existing, were often deemed less effective for the intricate, winding, and often poorly constructed flues of Victorian homes. Householders, from the grandest aristocrat to the humblest shopkeeper, wanted their chimneys cleaned, and they wanted it done cheaply and effectively. Child labor provided that solution. Secondly, the master sweeps formed a powerful, albeit often disreputable, guild. They fiercely resisted any attempts at reform, arguing that children were indispensable for the trade, that mechanical brushes were inefficient, and that legislative interference would destroy their livelihoods. They propagated myths about the chimney sweep boys' natural aptitude for the job, painting a picture of happy, nimble lads rather than terrified, abused children. Thirdly, there was the widespread social indifference. These children were largely invisible, confined to the dark interiors of chimneys or scurrying through the streets before dawn. They were often from the lowest strata of society, paupers, orphans, or the children of the utterly destitute. Their suffering was easily rationalized or simply ignored by a society grappling with rapid social change and deeply ingrained class divisions. The suffering of the poor was often viewed as an unfortunate but inevitable part of the social order, or even as a moral failing on their part. The clean fireplace, the warm home, were paramount. The human cost was simply a price to be paid, out of sight, out of mind. But not everyone was blind. The campaign to abolish the use of climbing boys was one of the longest and most arduous reform movements of the Victorian era, stretching over nearly a century. Early advocates like Jonas Hanway, a philanthropist who had pushed for reform since the mid-18th century, tirelessly lobbied Parliament, publishing pamphlets and gathering testimonies. His efforts led to the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1788, which attempted to regulate the trade, requiring sweeps to be licensed and prohibiting the apprenticeship of boys under 8. But the law was weakly enforced and riddled with loopholes. Master sweep simply circumvented it, continuing to employ children as assistants or helpers rather than official apprentices. The fight continued. Throughout the early 19th century, more parliamentary committees investigated the trade, collecting harrowing testimonies from former climbing boys and concerned citizens. The details were shocking. Boys sleeping head to toe in cellars, sharing one blanket, covered in fleas. Children forced to work for weeks without a wash. The horrific accounts of suffocations and severe injuries. The most prominent voice in the later stages of the campaign was that of Lord Shaftesbury, a relentless social reformer. For decades, he championed the cause in Parliament, battling against the entrenched interests of master sweeps and the apathy of his fellow legislators. He brought the grim realities of the trade into the public consciousness, forcing society to confront the moral stain on its conscience. Literature also played a crucial role. Charles Dickens, though often mistakenly credited with solely exposing the plight of sweeps through Oliver Twist, certainly helped to highlight the broader issue of child exploitation and urban squalor. However, it was Charles Kingsley's 1863 novel, The Water Babies, a fairy tale for a land baby, that truly galvanized public opinion regarding climbing boys. This allegorical tale, with its protagonist Tom, a young chimney sweep who falls into a river and becomes a water baby, explicitly exposed the cruelties of the trade to a wide, middle-class audience. Kingsley's vivid, albeit fantastical, descriptions of Tom's suffering and the horrors of his life as a sweep resonated deeply, shamefully highlighting the reality for many who had previously dismissed it as a distant, abstract problem. The slow legislative grind finally began to yield results. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1834 tried to strengthen earlier laws, setting the minimum age for apprentices at 10. Again, enforcement was lax. The 1840 Act raised the minimum age to 16 and attempted to ban boys from actually climbing chimneys. But the climbing boy clause remained largely unenforced. It was a common sight for master sweeps to pay a small fine and then simply continue sending their boys up the chimneys. The fines were cheaper than using mechanical brushes or losing contracts. The final decisive blow came with the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875. This act, after nearly a century of struggle, finally made it illegal for anyone under the age of 21 to sweep chimneys by climbing them. Crucially, it also made it mandatory for master sweeps to register with the police, giving authorities the power to inspect premises and ensure compliance. This shift in enforcement, coupled with the growing public awareness and a greater availability of mechanical brushes, finally brought an end to the horrific practice of using climbing boys. By the late 19th century, the image of the chimney sweep began to transform. The small, soot-covered, terrified child was gradually replaced by a man using mechanical equipment. The memory of the climbing boy, however, faded quickly from public consciousness, pushed aside by the relentless march of progress and a societal desire to forget its uglier truths. But we must not forget. The story of the Victorian chimney sweeps is a potent reminder of the human cost of industrialization, of the moral blindness that can grip a society, and of the profound suffering inflicted upon the most vulnerable in the pursuit of convenience and profit. These children endured a daily regimen of pain, fear, and degradation. Their bodies were deformed, their lungs ravaged, their skin consumed by a slow, agonizing cancer. Their minds were scarred by claustrophobia, terror, and the crushing realization that their lives were considered disposable. It wasn't just harsh labor, it was systematic torture, a calculated breaking of spirit and flesh, carried out in the dark confines of household chimneys, out of sight, out of mind. The screams of children suffocating in soot, the metallic tang of blood mixed with grime, the stench of festering wounds, the gnawing pain of cancerous lesions. These were the unseen realities behind the clean facades of Victorian prosperity. Their story is a testament to the fact that progress, unchecked by compassion and ethical oversight, can breed unspeakable cruelties. It is also a powerful reminder of the arduous, often thankless work of reformers who, against immense odds, fought for the rights and dignity of those who could not fight for themselves. The legacy of the climbing boys serves as a chilling historical mirror, asking us to question the hidden costs of our own comforts and to remain vigilant against the forces that would, even today, seek to exploit the innocent for gain. The torture of the Victorian chimney sweeps was indeed far, far more brutal than you can possibly imagine.